Welcome everyone. This is our first video lecture for History 112, U.S. History 1865 to the present. And we are starting off with the period known as Reconstruction. So today I'm going to talk mainly about what Reconstruction was, how it proceeded, both in Washington and then on the ground in the South. And we will be looking at why Reconstruction ended up largely failing by the 1870s. So that is kind of what we're going to be talking about today. So I'm going to start off talking about this period, uh, what happened during the Civil War, to begin to think about what Reconstruction might look like. And government officials began to think about what Reconstruction might look like before the war was even over. In 1863, President Lincoln issued a proclamation of amnesty and reconstruction, which offered a full pardon to all Southerners who would take an oath of allegiance to the Union and acknowledge emancipation. This was known as the 10% plan. And that was because it provided that once 10% or more of the voting population of any state had taken that oath, they were then authorized to set up a loyal state government. And by the following year, in 1864, the states of Louisiana and Arkansas had done just that. You might be asking, well, that seems like a pretty lenient plan. Why did Lincoln want such a lenient Reconstruction policy? Well, keep in mind that he's still fighting the war. He is looking to try to shorten the war if possible. He's looking for a way to bring the war to an end. So he's hoping to weaken the Southern cause by making it easier for Confederates to switch sides. And he's hoping to further his emancipation policy by making it clear that any new state governments had to abolish slavery. Congress, however, did not like this plan. They said they were going to refuse to seat the representatives and senators that Louisiana and Arkansas elected under these new unionized governments. Congress opposed Lincoln's plan for a few reasons. Some of the more radical members of Congress, they were known as the Radical Republicans, led by Thaddeus Stevens, whom you can see there. They were very anti-slavery, and they wanted to make the rights of the freedmen, especially the right to vote, a condition of readmission to the Union. The moderate Republicans in Congress really weren't all that interested in protecting the rights of the freedmen, but they mistrusted white Southerners and they didn't want the old ruling class that had been in power in the South to come back into power once the war was over. Congress also believed that Lincoln was exceeding his presidential authority. Lincoln was operating here on the theory that since secession was illegal, the Confederate States had never actually left the Union. Rather, individuals had seceded, and therefore he could use his pardoning power as president to ensure that the voting population in those states were loyal, and then these state governments would be legitimate. Congress said, no, that's not really what happened here. The southern states had given up their place in the Union, and only Congress had the power to decide when and how to readmit them. Congress then passes a piece of legislation known as the Wade-Davis Bill in 1864. And this was their idea of how Reconstruction should work. It required that 50% of voters had to take a loyalty oath before before that state could be readmitted to the Union. And once that had happened, then anybody who could prove that they had not willingly supported the Confederacy could then vote in an election for delegates to a constitutional convention. Now, the Wade-Davis bill did not protect the rights of voting for the freedmen, but it did give the federal courts the power to enforce emancipation. Lincoln ends up using what is called a pocket veto. Basically, rather than vetoing the Wade Davis bill outright, he just simply refused to sign it and he let the bill expire. So things were now at an impasse. Neither Congress nor President Lincoln could agree on what to do. And then Lincoln was assassinated. And it was never really clear what kind of Reconstruction plan he would have pushed for had he lived to see the post Civil War era. So that sort of is where we are at the end of the war. Andrew Johnson then takes over as president after Lincoln dies. Johnson was a Southerner. He was from Tennessee. And he had based his whole political career up to that point on representing non slave owning white Southerners, who were the majority of white Southerners, actually. He was very much opposed to the wealthy planter elite classes who had controlled Southern politics really from the very beginning. He was the only senator from a Confederate state who remained loyal to the Union, and he continued to serve in Washington during the war. But even though he opposed the wealthy planter elite, he's not anti-slavery. In fact, he only objected to slave owning as a privilege of the wealthy minority, and he argued that slavery should be expanded, that every family should have enslaved people. So you might be wondering, well, that he seems like an odd choice to be Lincoln's running mate in 1864. Why was he chosen? Well, at this point, again, they're still trying to end the war. It was thought that having a pro-administration Democrat and Southern Unionist on the ticket would then make the ticket stronger. Lincoln was really trying to get himself reelected. No one ever thought that Andrew Johnson would become president. Initially, some of the Republicans in Congress supported Johnson because they knew that he was an enemy of the wealthy planter elite and that he would be likely to punish Confederates. But gradually, a deep disagreement emerges between Johnson and the Republicans who are in control of Congress. So what plan does Johnson propose? He says Southern states can re-enter the Union if they declared secession illegal, if they repudiated Confederate debt, and if they ratified the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery. And after all that was done, Reconstruction would be complete. So it was a very similar plan to what Lincoln had proposed. So Johnson sets about implementing this plan. So what happens when this plan is implemented? Well, delegates from several states end up approving Johnson's recommendations, declaring secession illegal, ratifying the 13th Amendment, but they give some qualifications. Some of these states abolish slavery, but they don't bother to ratify the 13th Amendment. Others said, yes, we're going to ratify it, but we're going to put caveats on that and say that Congress doesn't have the power to dictate what happens to the former enslaved people or to prevent enslavers from being compensated from the loss of their quote-unquote property. Eventually, though, the 13th Amendment does officially become ratified and declared part of the Constitution. And the passage of the 13th Amendment settles this question over slavery, but it raises a whole host of new questions. Was it really possible to eradicate the institution of slavery, given how total it was? Does the end of slavery mean racial equality? What does the end of slavery mean for the political and economic power in the United States? And what does it mean to be a free person in a post-slavery America? So what is freedom? What does freedom mean in this new post-slavery United States? Now, of course, there was one form of slavery or involuntary servitude that the 13th Amendment does not prohibit, except as a punishment for crime. If you look at the language of the 13th Amendment, it adds in this little qualification there. Slavery is prohibited anywhere in the United States except as a punishment for crime. And by the time the 13th Amendment was drafted, this linking with slavery and involuntary servitude, slavery or involuntary servitude with punishment, that was considered to be almost kind of boilerplate language. It had been included in laws that had been proposed by Congress prior to the Civil War. In 1862, laws that were passed by Congress limiting slavery in the territories, and nearly all of the state constitutions that entered the Union, free states that entered the Union from going all the way back to 1803 up to 1865, they had this language in their state constitutions, except as a punishment for crime. And because it was so familiar, it's not even really considered to be an issue when it was passed. There were just a handful of people that thought it might be a problem. The states of the South certainly noticed this loophole in the 13th Amendment, and they sought to exploit it. A lot of Southern governments in the early days of Reconstruction enacted legislation that was essentially designed to reestablish the power dynamics, the power relationships between blacks and whites that had existed prior to the Civil War. South Carolina and Mississippi passed laws that were known as the Black Codes that were designed to regulate black behavior and impose social and economic control on the freedmen. They did grant some rights to Black Americans, like the right to own property, the right to marry, the right to make contracts, but they also put limits or denied other fundamental rights. For example, here is an excerpt from Mississippi's vagrant law, which basically required all freedmen to carry papers proving that they had a job, that they had some means of employment. And if you had no proof, you could be arrested, you could be fined, you could even be essentially re-enslaved and leased out to your former enslaver. Here you can see in this quote, it says, if any freed man, free Negro, or mulatto, which means a person of mixed race heritage, convicted of any of the misdemeanors provided against in this act, shall fail or refuse to pay the fine, such person shall be hired out by the sheriff or other officer at public outcry to any white person who will pay said fine and take that convict for the shortest time. So this is really basically a loophole in the 13th Amendment that allows the states of the South to kind of begin to reestablish and put limits upon the rights of the freedmen. Johnson approved the actions of the Southern states, and he even began to pardon members of the old wealthy elite who came to him asking for leniency. Congress, though, then said, we're not going to seat these Southern delegations. We're going to establish a committee to review Reconstruction policy and set further conditions for readmission. So now we have this showdown going on between the president and the Congress over Reconstruction. Congress is basically saying, we can't solve the problem of Reconstruction by just having former Confederates say, yes, we're guilty and we would like a pardon, please. Unless the social and political system of the South was fundamentally altered, the old wealthy planter elite classes would just come back into power and all the struggle of the Civil War would be in vain. Congress said, we have the power to determine the legitimacy of our own members. And we can say that these Southern elections were invalid because slavery gave most of the power to this small minority, and these Southern state governments are not truly representative of their population. So in order to fully reconstruct the South, Congress said new conditions have to be established, and that meant not just abolishing slavery, but we need to give the freedmen the right to vote. Congress kind of has the upper hand here because Johnson can pardon anybody he likes, but Congress has the power to refuse to seat those members of Congress until Reconstruction is done to their liking. So the Republicans in Congress insist upon passing what becomes known as the 14th Amendment and insist upon giving the freedmen the right to vote. They were very adamant about this because partly for political reasons. They expected that black men in the South would vote for Republicans. Why would they vote for Democrats who had been in control of the South? And they were the ones who had maintained the system of slavery for so long. So it stood to reason that all those newly freed black men would abandon the Democratic Party and become Republicans. So the Republican Party would benefit politically. Most Republicans at this point don't really believe in full racial equality. Indeed, most Americans at this time can't really fathom this idea, but they do have this ideological commitment to equal rights in the abstract. And they were really worried that the South was going to fall back under planter control unless blacks are given the vote. So Congress passes two bills early in 1866, and they send them to Johnson for his signature. One of these bills extends the life of the Freedmen's Bureau, which was an organization that had been set up to help former slaves, provide them with relief, education, economic assistance, legal assistance. The second piece of legislation was a civil rights bill designed to eliminate the black codes. Johnson promptly vetoes both of these bills. And the veto of the Freedmen's Bureau ends up standing, but the veto that Congress is able to overturn Johnson's veto of the Civil Rights Act. And this was the first time in American history that Congress had overturned a presidential veto. And that just tells you how powerful Congress was at this point and how bitter this fight between Congress and the president was becoming. Congress then moves to pass the 14th Amendment, which is this incredibly important amendment to the Constitution. It gives the federal government the responsibility for guaranteeing equal rights under the law to all Americans. Johnson decides at this point that he's going to create a new political party. He calls it the National Union Party. And this is, sort of intended to kind of unite the small number of Republicans who were still supporting him with the Democratic Party, which is kind of reviving. So in 1866, his National Union Party runs very unsuccessfully against the Republican Party in the 1866 congressional midterm elections. And they essentially become a referendum on the 14th Amendment. The Republican majority ends up getting strengthened in Congress in 1866. And so now that Congress is basically firmly in control, they begin to enact a series of plans in 1867, 1868. And this is sort of sometimes called radical Reconstruction. I like to call it Congressional Reconstruction because I don't think these ideas were all that radical. It was called Radical Reconstruction at the time because that was the name that, sort of most of the members of Congress who were kind of, sort of more radical, they called themselves the Radical Republicans. But it really is not a great name. So what does Congressional Reconstruction involve? So essentially it said the southern states would be put under military rule until black suffrage, until the right to vote was fully secured. And there was a split over how long this period would last. The radicals wanted to have a longer period. The moderates wanted that military occupation to be shorter. Eventually, the moderates won out, and any state who ratified a new constitution providing for black suffrage would then be readmitted to the Union. And the assumption here is that giving black men the right to vote would be enough to empower the freedmen to protect themselves. So it ends up actually being a retreat from the truly radical position that you needed to have a sustained federal presence in the South. Johnson, as you might imagine, thoroughly opposes Congress's new policy, and he sets about doing everything he can to obstruct the administration of radical Reconstruction. He fires people who agreed with this plan. He sort of countermands the orders of generals who were in charge of those southern military districts who were attempting to enforce the new legislation. Congress responds to all of this obstruction by passing legislation designed to limit presidential power, including something called the Tenure of Office Act. This act required the Senate to approve whenever the president wanted to remove cabinet officials or other government officials whose appointments had been approved by the Senate. So then Johnson tries to fire his Secretary of War, and when he does this, Congress moves to impeach him. So the process of impeachment, it works, sort of fairly simply. The House brings up charges against the president, and then he or she is tried by the Senate. In this case, as would be the case in the late 1990s with President Clinton, and then with, sort of President Trump as well, the Senate failed to convict Johnson. Of course, the vote here was much closer. They were really only one vote shy of the necessary 2/3 to convict and remove Johnson from office. 1868, of course, was a presidential election year, and the Republicans nominated the Union's most decorated and celebrated general, Ulysses S. Grant. Reconstruction became the central issue of the campaign, and Grant ends up winning the election. Congress then goes about passing the 15th Amendment, guaranteeing African American men the right to vote. And you can see here, this is just a quick chart that goes over the different amendments that were passed during Reconstruction. And we're going to talk in class, we're going to talk later about how these amendments were really central to the kind of remaking of the American government during the period of Reconstruction. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, but especially the 14th Amendment, really represented almost a second American Revolution. It really redefined what it meant to be a citizen of the United States. It redefined the relationship between states and the federal government. It, of course, the 15th Amendment, of course, gives Black men the right to vote, and they really represent a fundamental shift. All right, so while all these battles are going on in Washington, what is life actually like for those who are going to be most affected by Reconstruction? We have to keep in mind that the South is basically devastated here. The Civil War had become a total war. It had become a war of attrition where the only way for the Union to win was to completely ground the other side and its society into the dust. And in that sense, it was really one of the first modern wars as we know it. The Union Army had followed a scorched earth policy toward the end of the war. They had gone through the South, destroying almost everything in its path. So people in the South are destitute, they are hungry, they are demoralized, and the entire basis for Southern society, which had rested upon the institution of slavery, was no more. But the big question in the South was, how would relations between newly freed African Americans and white Southerners, how would these relationships pan out? So different groups in the South had different agendas for Reconstruction. Newly freed Black people were looking for their independence. They were looking to exercise the economic and political rights of full citizens. White Southerners, most white Southerners wanted to keep newly freed Black people in an inferior status, somewhere between, slavery and freedom. And there were a lot of Northerners who came to the South after the war. Some came for humanitarian reasons, other for more materialistic reasons. But a lot of Northerners came with the idea that they could reform the South with the help of the freedmen. Probably the biggest question as the war comes to a close centers on the issue of land and who is going to work the land. Slavery had been the backbone of the Southern economy. And now that it was gone, what kind of labor system would take its place? A lot of people assumed that the South was still going to be a predominantly agricultural society, and someone would have to harvest the crops. After General Sherman captured the city of Savannah in Georgia, he met with the leaders of the local black community there to ask them what they wanted to see happen now that the war was almost over. And you can see this is a little bit of an excerpt from the minutes of that meeting. You can see they're asking these colored ministers, who were kind of the leading figures in the black community in Savannah. They ask them, state in what manner you think you can take care of yourselves and how you can best assist the government in maintaining your freedom. And their answer is very interesting. They say, the way we can best take care of ourselves is to have land and turn in and till it by our labor, and we can soon maintain ourselves and have something to spare. And to assist the government, the young men should enlist in the service of the government. So we want these young men to become soldiers and to fight in the army and serve as they may be wanted. We want to be placed on land until we are able to buy it and make it our own. So they wanted to determine their own economic relationships. They wanted to be economically independent. They wanted to serve the national government in any way that they could. They wanted to stay on land that their families had spent generations farming. After this meeting, Sherman issued Special Field Order number 15, which sets aside areas along the coast of South Carolina and Georgia for black families to settle. And these plots were divided into 40 acres of land each. And that's where this famous phrase, 40 acres and a mule, comes from. So there was this real sense at the end of the war that perhaps there was this promise that freedmen were going to be able to get some of this land. But it was not to be realized for most African Americans. President Johnson pardoned the white owners of the land and ordered that their land be returned to them. And more sweeping proposals for land redistribution in the South never ended up making it through Congress. So most black workers who had physical possessions of these small farms never end up actually getting the legal title to the land, and they eventually end up getting kicked off. So at the end of the war, now after the passage of the 14th, 15th Amendments, at least in theory, African Americans have the rights of citizens. They enjoy equal protection under the law. Black men now have the right to vote. Life is definitely changing for African Americans beyond simply gaining political rights. Freedmen claimed a variety of rights for themselves, and they begin to establish their own institutions. One of the most basic rights that African Americans could now claim was the right to establish a family. Under slavery, if you remember, black people had no control over their family life. If you were enslaved, you had no legal right to marry. And even if you did marry in a religious or a symbolic ceremony, that bond had no legal standing. And your owner could sell off your husband or your wife whenever he or she felt like it. And furthermore, you had no control over your own children. They belonged to your enslaver. And he could make them do whatever he wanted. She could punish them as she saw fit, even sell them off. So the right to establish a family was an extremely important and basic right. And Black Americans embraced it enthusiastically after the war. Through marriage, Black men claimed citizenship. Legalized marriage was a way for the freedmen to take on the rights that every independent head of household had in America. Not just political rights, but the right to control the labor of their wives and their children. Some former slaves began to use the courts. which was, of course, an institution that had previously been closed to them to assert their rights against both white and black people, suing over things like domestic violence, child support, assault, debt. Black people also began to form churches and fraternal associations, political organizations, schools. Education was a huge priority. And the schools that newly freed African Americans established in the South were a huge improvement on what had been before, where essentially there had been no formal education whatsoever. Most Black people during this period viewed the idea of having separate schools for Black children as an opportunity rather than as a form of discrimination. But of course, these schools would eventually evolve into segregated public school systems. In addition to claiming the right to marry, claiming the right to organize, the right to educate their children, freedmen also began to organize themselves politically. The most active political organization that mobilized newly enfranchised African American voters in the South was a group called the Union League. The Union League was actually an organization that had started in the North during the Civil War. It was kind of a patriotic club to support the Union and the Republican Party. And like a lot of political groups in this era, they were a secret organization. And after the war, the League then began to go down and spread throughout the South, organizing loyal white Southerners and African Americans. And they began to go out beyond just in the sort of urban areas, go out to some of the rural areas of the South to promote the League and promote the idea of being loyal to the federal government. And this was sort of pretty dangerous work that these Union League organizers were doing. They were educating former slaves about their political duties as citizens. They were promoting community development. And they also essentially created their own kind of militias to try to arm themselves. They were up against this very sort of militant white supremacist groups that were trying to organize and push back against Reconstruction. So they're doing all of this, African Americans are doing all of this because in the face really of these very vigorous efforts by white Southerners to try to impose control over their private lives and shape their new identities as freed people. The Republican Party ends up taking over most of the state legislatures in the South, but it's a very unstable coalition. It's made up largely of businessmen, many who are recent arrivals from the North. These are the so-called carpetbaggers. That was a derogatory term that was sort of late that these northern businessmen got. They're looking to get the power of the federal government to give them money to support private businesses, private enterprise. Then you have kind of poor white farmers who are the second part of the coalition. They want to see their interests protected at the expense of wealthy landowners. And the third part of that coalition are newly enfranchised Black men. And they are forming the vast majority of voting Republicans in the South. They want, of course, education. They want civil rights. They want to own land. So each of these groups have their own distinct goals, and they're not necessarily fully supportive of each other. In the short time that Republicans are in power in the South, they do achieve some pretty notable things. They attempted to improve public education. The public education system prior to the Civil War in the South had been basically non-existent. They attempt to expand public services and make a major effort to foster economic development and subsidize internal improvements, infrastructure building, that sort of thing. In general, though, a lot of these Republican state legislatures end up becoming very corrupt. And this was not unusual, right? This is during an era when private interests, businesses end up kind of, buying government favors all the time. Politicians expected to take bribes and accept contributions and do favors for people. And even though, as you can see here, sort of from this sort of roster, there were, sort of a lot of white members of these state legislatures, and they were in control of most of the southern state governments. It's the African Americans who end up getting a lot of the blame for this corruption. Critics of Reconstruction claimed that giving black people the right to vote had been a disaster because they were inherently unfit to govern. And therefore, all the corruption had come from including black people within the government. 16 African Americans served in Congress between 1869 and 1880, but they were not dominating most of the state legislatures. No black governors were elected during Reconstruction. The most of the corrupt were white Southerners, some of Northern carpetbaggers, some native white Southerners, and the black members of these state legislatures had to kind of go along and support these corrupt and wasteful Republican regimes. So the idea that corruption resulted from including African Americans in Southern politics was a total myth, a total fabrication that was invented by these critics of Reconstruction. And not only do the freedmen have to contend with the corruption of these southern state legislatures, having to go along with, sort of a lot of this corruption, having to, face a lot of these efforts to bind them economically into a subordinate role, but they also have to fear violence. The main threat to the freedmen came from groups like the Ku Klux Klan and other societies that were set up after the Civil War that were really bent on restoring white supremacy by intimidating black people who sought to exercise their new political rights. The Klan first gets organized in Tennessee in 1866, and it spreads pretty rapidly throughout the South. And they begin to use these increasingly lawless and brutal tactics. It was a grassroots vigilante movement. It was not a centralized organization. And because of that, it's very difficult to suppress it because it's secret, it's decentralized, they are very willing to use any form of violence to get their way, and they enjoyed enormous popular support among the white population in the South. This is a document from a military officer giving back to his superiors in Washington, and he's describing the kind of atmosphere of lawlessness that exists in Texas during this period. And he describes how the civil law east of the Trinity River is almost a dead letter. It's basically anarchy out there. In some counties, all of the civil officers are members of the Klan, and they're just basically running roughshod over everyone, not just black people, but also anybody who supports the Union. And he concludes by saying the murder of Negroes is so common as to render it impossible to keep an accurate account of them. So in the 1870s, Congress tried to suppress the Klan by passing a series of laws providing federal protection for black suffrage and authorizing the army to actually go in and use force against these terrorist groups. These were known as the Force Acts or the Ku Klux Klan Acts. And they made interfering with voting rights a federal crime. They established government supervision of elections. And this is enough to put down some of the violence and ensure that the elections in 1872 were relatively peaceful. The Democratic Party basically responds to this by changing their strategy and changing their ideology. The Democratic Party, which is sort of reorganizing in the South, begins to appeal openly to white supremacy. And there's this new resurgence of violence designed to basically reduce Republican, especially black Republican voting in the South. By this time, we're getting into the 1870s here. The Northern public is increasingly disenchanted with having a lot of federal intervention in the South. The last time the president decides to use force in the South is in 1874 when a paramilitary group in Louisiana known as the White League, another one of these terrorist organizations, tries to overthrow a Republican government accused of stealing the election. And by 1876, Republicans were only in control of South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida. All of the other southern states had fallen under control of the Democratic Party, which was openly allied with groups like the Ku Klux Klan. So this is a map of the southern states under Reconstruction. And as you can see, there are two dates beneath the name of each state. The first date beneath each state name indicates the year the state gets readmitted back into the Union. The second date indicates the year a state election produced Democratic control of the legislature and the governorship. And that's a significant date because, as you can see, in some places, this period of readmission to the Union and black voting and, sort of an experiment really in having a biracial government ends. So in Texas, it lasts for about 3 years, 1870 to 1873. In Georgia, it lasts for only a year, 1870 to 1871. It's really we can really see in this map how Reconstruction is first implemented and then when it begins to decline. So this brings us to 1876. 1876, a presidential election year. The results of the election in 1876 between the Republican Rutherford B. Hayes and the Democrat Samuel J. Tilden were disputed. Tilden had clearly won the popular vote, but the returns from 3 of the southern states, South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida, not coincidentally, the 3 southern states that are still controlled by Republicans, were disputed. And it was unclear who was going to win the Electoral College vote. The outcome of the election remained undecided for months. Congress then appoints a special commission to determine who had won those electoral votes. Originally, that commission had been equally divided between Republicans and Democrats, but it fell under control of the Republicans when one of the members resigns and a Republican is appointed to take his place. So the commission, not unsurprisingly, gives the disputed vote to Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican, but the result still has to be ratified by both houses of Congress. And Democrats in the House are threatening to oppose it. They're threatening to filibuster. So the Republicans and the Democrats get together and they make a secret backroom deal. They negotiate a compromise, basically saying that we're going to allow the Republicans to win the election. Rutherford B. Hayes, yep, he can become president on 2 conditions. The Democrats said, we want guarantee of federal aid to the South, and we want all federal troops to be removed from the South, from the southern states. When Hayes comes in and takes office, he immediately complies with this. He orders the army not to resist a Democratic takeover of the remaining Republican state governments. So now the entire South is firmly under the control of white Democrats, and Southern black Republicans have basically been abandoned. This marks the end of Reconstruction. So what we're really seeing here is it's the end of Reconstruction. It's not necessarily the end and kind of it doesn't necessarily mark this, sharp dividing line, whereas after, 1877, black people lose all rights in the South. It doesn't happen that quickly, but it does mean that this sort of process of Reconstruction is essentially over, and the northern state governments and the northern states have essentially said, we are no longer interested in spending a lot of time and effort to reform the South. We're going to kind of just let them do their own thing. And now black men, theoretically at least, have the right to vote, even though their rights are being threatened, violently threatened. And we're just basically going to kind of wash our hands of the whole thing. People at this point, at least white Americans at this point, are really wanting to move on from the Civil War. They want to kind of reunite the country, and not, kind of continue all of these battles. So we're going to look in more depth this week at the process of Reconstruction, at the battles that were fought over Reconstruction, and particularly at the passage of the 14th Amendment and why the 14th Amendment is so critical and so crucial to American history going forward. So that's what we're going to be exploring for the rest of the week. Now, so for those of you who are in my in-person class, these are the things you should have done before coming to class on September 11th. You should definitely have read Chapter 15 in your textbook and completed the reading quiz. You should make sure to also read Chapter 1 in your Going to the Source book. We're going to be looking at particularly the congressional hearings that were held upon the terrorism, the political terrorism that was going on in the South. And so that is kind of what we're going to be looking at on Wednesday. For those of you in my online class, you should do all of these things as well and read Chapter 1 in preparation for our online discussion this week. And if you have any questions or anything that I can help with, please do let me know. You can either email me, you can post in our discussion forums online, or you can just come up to me after class and talk to me about anything you might need to talk about. And again, welcome everybody to the class, and I'm looking forward to a great term with you all. Take care, everyone.